We had very comprehensive presentations by each of the speakers. I think they each deserve an hour, but unfortunately we have a very short time for this. I'm going to ask a few questions first before opening up to the floor. Maybe let's boil it down a lot more. There's a lot of incredible information and experiences that you have shared, which is very valuable, from high-level achievements to grassroots and everything in between. Coming back to the topic that we have, which is vibrancy and identity of cities. Now, why does it matter? Why does the identity of a city matter? Why does heritage matter? How do you sell? I mean, we heard a few things from Laurence now, or Sita, as you are more commonly known, right? About sustainability and all that. How do you sell it to decision makers, especially those sitting in the Ministry of Finance, right? That this matters and we need to invest in this.
Can I volunteer?
Yes, please, Hamdan.
I think, coming from an investment banking background and working for a sovereign fund, the logic for us is very simple at the end of the day. As we all know that cities are competing, no longer nations. The competition is between cities. If every city, if I use the term what my colleague said just now, is Coca-Colaized or McDonaldized, or if every city is going to be, if every city mimics Singapore or Hong Kong in Asia, what's the point of going to those cities? What's the point of, because when you go to a city, there's a certain, certain attractive factors that you go to. Apart from job, you're talking about quality of life, certain factors that shapes a particular identity of those cities. Now, unless and if it is tailored to each of those inherent strengths of the cities, you will not be able to compete effectively. So fundamentally, I think for the reason why vibrancy and livability and identity is important is actually it's all about competition.
I think the most important element in the place we live is the community and the cultural feel. That means if you enter a city or enter a place, you must have that certain feel in order to get the people together. That's the reason why you can see that the attraction, if you are just comparing shopping centers and all that, it's all the same. But then when we start to add on certain culture and certain perception of differentiation, then that makes the difference. That's what the thing, I call it the currency that we have to hold, even though it is more a banking term, but that's how we have to hold. I think the difference between Bombay and New Delhi and Yogyakarta and Surabaya. So if you have been traveling, you will make sense of it. You really feel there is a difference.
Maybe I ask the conservationists and Nava and Sita, why is the past relevant for the future? We're talking about the future of urban living.
Well, actually, I mean, it's an old saying that those who forget their past are compelled to repeat it. But I think in conservation, it's another story. Once we wipe out the past, there is nothing that we can do to bring it back. And I think even when we look at forget conservation for once, and if we talk about, as you mentioned, competing cities, today when we look at London, it's packaged as an international destination. It's a business city, but then the amount of investment in packaging its cultural sites is equal. I mean, with the whole idea of Paris with La Défense and new development, at the same time, the kind of investment into reviving areas like the Louvre or just reviving historic monuments, if nothing else, it's a clear business idea that when you're looking at tourism dollars or forget tourism dollars, if you're looking at positioning yourself on the international level, your city has to be able to offer more than just business centers and conference facilities. There's something beyond that draws people to those cities. And not just that, but even for the local identity, I think it's eventually something that encapsulates the core of a city is what the citizens feel, how they feel identified to a city. And very often it's that historic layer that gives each city its soul.
Yeah, actually heritage itself is a capital. It's capital of social capital, cultural capital, natural capital, as well as economic capitals. And actually also a learning points for further development. If we want to develop for further urban living, for instance, we have to really learn what is the urban living previously. There are a lot of order, a lot of actually codes that we can learn. And why usually they are better? Because they build it with patience. I think this is something that now we lost about this patience. Thank you.
But in this work, there's always a lot of tensions, right? There's a tension between progress, development, poverty alleviation, and heritage. And Abba, as you say, heritage quite often falls to the bottom of the list. There's tension between, as you mentioned, the commercialization, right, and keeping the identity of the past. Commercialization leads to a lot of homogenization, particularly with globalization. Tension between a top-down approach and a bottom-up. What is strategic for the government and what's bottom-up organically, that comes organically from the grassroots. Maybe can you, each of you give some color on how you negotiate the tensions, the different stakeholders who are going to be pulling in different directions? How do you bring them to the table and make progress together?
I think it's a tough sell, but you have to do it. The last 1 month, I have what they call it public session, and we are building an light rail transport. Everybody accept it, they like it, but not on their front side. That's all. That's it. I don't mind this. They all agree. They all agree we should solve the problem of traffic congestion. We should have public transport. But when come to the site, and they say this is near my place, I don't want it to happen. So, how do you resolve it? And well, we have to continuously work with them and explain to them. Of course, at the end, I think my argument is that based on the previous cases, the property prices around that developed area is far much higher than before. Of course, there are also issues that in terms of whether the lane affect the historical site and all that, then we really need to be very clear in what we are doing. That is the what they call the balancing act that we need. But town hall meetings, as far as I see, is a must, and we got to get people commitment. But as I see it, I do not have in many of my decisions 100% agreement. So long as it makes reasonable, fair situation, then somebody will have to decide. And unfortunately, since I cannot look much further, so I have to decide on that. That's all that is going to happen. But that is the reality. The reality in the development, unless you build a new township, the reality in the development, you have a lot of trade-offs. Yeah.
And Abba, maybe you can be next, because you talked about a very grassroots approach, and you've done tremendous work in your citizen initiative in urban restoration. And you ended with this phrase, this sentence, don't wait for government, we just do it ourselves, right? But at the end of the day, you can do so much more if you have government at the table. So how do you bring government and private sector and all those really difficult players, to the table and
well,
work with you?
In 1995, Bombay became the first city in India which established heritage regulations. And until 1995, you only had these 3,500 national monuments. So everything else that was urban heritage was really unprotected. And given the fact that we had the highest real estate values, it would have just meant wiping out whole sections of cities to get new buildings in. I think in the last 2 decades, we've shown through, small, they're not ambitious, but small models that it is possible to coexist. And when I started working in conservation, and I would introduce myself to a municipal commissioner and say, I'm a conservation architect, there was one fellow who asked me, you're a conversation architect, and that's exactly what I'm doing today, but that's not my bread and butter. So the whole idea of conservation and heritage preservation was completely alien to the Indian planning vocabulary, because for the last 60 years, we've talked about redevelopment, mass. That's why we've had these kind of policies where a planner doesn't go to the site, sits in his air-conditioned office and says, this is a historic area, I've got to improve it, so it means road widening. So he cuts off, through historic areas to bring vehicles into areas which were originally pedestrian. But I think in the last 2 decades, we've, through Bombay, been able to demonstrate this whole idea that we need to look at historic cities. And now I can safely say that in the last 5 years, we've had, at the national government level, a change because of such activities. So we have something called the Jawaharlal Nehru Urban Renewal Program that is actually looking at those inner city areas. And if in the first 10 years, they even managed to just provide underground sewage and managed to remove the clutter of electrical cables and just clean up those areas with better solid waste management, that would be a start. But individually, we've had only in this 13th finance plan for the first time, the national government allocating sums of $20 million to $15 million to state governments to look at their historic areas. So it's been a change, but it's been a long battle to get our voice heard at the national government level to be able to acknowledge this. So I think that's why there needs to be this, because national governments don't look at agendas unless somebody keeps repeating them and again and again. Otherwise, your voice isn't heard. And we're still a marginal community who talk about preservation.
Hamdan, how do you balance the interests and
I think
stakeholders?
At the end of the day, I think I agree with Tan Sri Khalid. Governments needs to play the hand of God. But when you play the hand of God, you also ensure that there's enough amount of consultations, engagements, and so on. But decision has to be made. But I think the key lies in terms of how do you create platforms whereby government, citizens, private sector can communicate. I think that has been our work, whereby we have created this hybrid entity, that plays a role to bridge the divide between government, civil society, and the private sector, such that you're able to bring them to have a common aspiration, a common vision, because you only can find a win-win if you can get everybody into the same page. Now the challenge lies, how do you bring everyone to the same page? And you need to have the ability to work at the grassroots level to bring people together, to see what is the different people's point of view. Obviously, there are issues of property rights and there are issues of development rights and all of the other things. There's issues about gentrification, inclusiveness, and so on. Those things can be actually addressed by having proper tools or incentives, whereby, for example, anyone who forgoes rights to develop in historic areas, you can have the ability to transfer those rights of development to areas where you are identified as new zones for development. You have these mechanisms whereby you have transferable development rights. Planning whereby you want to ensure that key workers are part of the city. You don't want the key workers, because the cost of living in cities becomes expensive, to push to the periphery. Now, I think this is very important when, as I said, it must be a plan-led as opposed to a market-led environment. The market is needed to invest, but the market cannot be the one leading the planning. And when market leads, then you have outcomes that are not favorable.
Okay. Okay, Laretna, before I open up, because I
Actually, the crucial things, if we try to lobbying on this, is when the persons move to other positions, or we have the new leader, we have the new legislator, for instance. So we have to start from the beginning again to say what is heritage is, what is conservation is, etc. And in this case, we have to really make our trust stronger. And the key point is also networking. There will be the networking of our colleagues, that there will be as a demonstrator on the, about, for instance, like now, we have a problem on Trowulan, is the ancient cities in Java, that there will be a steel factory built on those remaining sites of the ancient city. So a lot of people then make a demonstrations. So this kind of a networking will be very, very important for us in regards to how we can have the position, because every time we have to reposition ourselves on the heritage conservation and the government management.
Thank you. We have a few minutes for a few questions from the floor. Can I invite a couple of interventions? David?
Laurence, may I first of all congratulate the speakers on some very interesting presentations about heritage. But as I listened to you, I thought about what Ho Tong Yen said this morning on replicating cities. The problem in China is very different. There's a great movement to cities that have not yet been built. Like Tianjin Eco-City was built out of salt pans. I think in India, some of these new cities that are being planned are also being planned on salt pans, like in Dolera. So how do you create heritage in a new city? How do you give that replication a sense of uniqueness and identity, and not just being another clone city? You know, all of us, I'm sure, in this room travel. And when I travel, sometimes I wake up in a hotel and I forget which city I'm in, because the hotel rooms all look the same. No, nice clean bed sheets, a hot shower, and 42-inch LCD TVs. But when you walk outside, you get a sense of where you are. But if you replicate cities and they all look the same, how do you create that sense of heritage where there is none before? Any ideas?
So any ideas? If you had a blank sheet, how do you create identity, heritage?
Yeah, for me, it's actually replicated cities. This is not heritage at all. So heritage is, of course, it is something that historically we can feel, we can see, and we can understand what is the history behind this and what is the value about this. But just replicate is just instant. So I think this is not, unless this is a place where a certain building is worth there and not destroyed, and then they make a replication of this based on the document. Like, for instance, in Okinawa, they have a Rikyu Palace, and now it's under the World Heritage of UNESCO. And this is totally burned out at that moment. But right now, they can develop, replicate from the original one, because they have the documentations. Everything the same as previously, including the intangible heritage, the way of carpenter, the way of constructions.
No, I agree, but when you're faced with the challenge of a completely new city from scratch, I think the word heritage should be kept aside, and it should just be iconic architecture. And I think Chandigarh with Corbusier is Chandigarh and is great, because you get a confident, great master to come up with a fresh canvas and great design. And I think that's something we owe our next generations, to leave some great architecture behind. Unfortunately, there's just so much of the same old, same new kind of replication happening, that we're creating new cities which don't have their own identity. And I think that's where we need to draw the line. Let heritage be confined to the genuine heritage, and let the new buildings be bright and new and ambitious and get great architects. So it's
I think we can just add, when you build new cities, I think the issue is about how do you create continuity. The language of what do you call, there is architectural and built environment continuity. Now, that's the creative expression of the architects. So unfortunately, many of the architects today have lost, that creativity in terms of being able to have that continuity. Now, I'm criticizing, I'm an economist, I'm an investment banker, so, I'm just looking at it from outside in a sense that, it's very frustrating. A lot of the architectural expression ends up with purely glass, steel, and modern built materials. Sometimes it's totally alien to the the environment that they are building these new cities in. They ignore the surrounding, they ignore the topography, they ignore the built environment that exists in that culture and so on. So having a sense of connectivity, culture, as well as knowing the nature of the place is going to be very important in building new cities that have distinctive values.
I suppose the people that you bring in have got values and ethos that are distinctive, and I think you need to take that into account. Okay, there are two questions, one at the back, the gentleman, and Vivian in front. Can we pass it to the gentleman at the back first?
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentations. I'm from the School of Public Policy. I'm a student of Masters in Public Policy. So I'm trying to approach this from the point of view of a policymaker, right? Qualitatively, I can understand that heritage is very important to preserve, it gives us identity, but a policymaker is often faced with competing demands. I have to solve a traffic problem versus trying to retain old buildings. How would you quantify the benefit of heritage so it sort of becomes easier? And the reason I ask this question is because until the disease burden of a lot of diseases were quantified, governments didn't understand the value of preventing a disease. So are you aware of any movement that quantifies the value of heritage that might make it easier for policymakers to sort of understand the importance of keeping this?
I think that's the beginning of the problem, that there are things in life you can't quantify. You can't quantify mother's love, and you can't quantify physical beauty, and you can't quantify a whole lot of things. And it begins with economists of your breed who want to quantify anything. That's the reason we are bottom of the food chain as far as funding goes. So I think I would never want to get into this trap of trying to monetize conservation and heritage. And I mean, it's like trying to say that, my mother who's 80 years old and wrinkled won't fetch the same sort of monetary benefits than his mother who's younger. I wouldn't want to get into that.
Maybe the economists can answer.
I will concur with my colleague here on the panel. There are things that you quantify and the things that you don't quantify. I think nation building is as much a quantitative is also qualitative. Ignoring the qualitative factors is only going to lead to a path of doom. Growth alone does not create welfare. And thinking about welfare requires to have the qualitative aspects, the arts, the green spaces, and all of these things. Now, as human society, if we ignore this, it's to our own peril.
I think the term intrinsic value, which I used to discuss with people that he's been staying in the house, and therefore he loves the house so much, and therefore that's the value of the house is on the what you call the intrinsic value. But I think, as I see, I think it is the fear that people will just ignore the what they call beauty, ignore style and all that will not be there, because I think the mindset, and there is such a thing called vision. I think you can see, you follow the progress of Singapore, and there is always that element of artistic and also the element of style. There is, of course, comparing the historic heritage style is different, but there is always the element of that. Of course, we should maintain, if need to be maintained, the traditional style and artifacts. It has to be maintained, but yet we need to balance. I don't think I've seen Pudong. It's built. I've seen the build. At the end, there is certain element that inside maybe the mindset of the architect or the mindset of the combination of that, there is certain element that you see is there. In fact, your CBD, there's certain element that is there. In fact, you become very creative trying to understand that element in this morning presentation. But that is there. But of course, if you get into the extreme past, that you have to maintain whatever you have to maintain, then it's a tough sell, because urbanization means changes. So urbanization means changes from rural to urban. It means changes. It means there is this element of buildings, element of dwellings, element of, there's always there. So I think the best I can say is the community will have to select better leaders, better people who will take care of that future. That's how it is. It's on that basis of competition, then you create so-called liveable cities and so forth.
Okay. Thanks, Tan Sri. Maybe a short answer to...
Yes, this is actually environmental economics is also a method to failure of this, because I learned from my PhD students that he made calculations between economic variance on Borobudur temples and compare of the cultural landscape of the Borobudur. So which one is actually appropriate? This is good for the decision makers. So it's such kind of things. So this is based on the environmental economic, and there are a lot of books on this. Thank you.
Okay. Time's up is flashing and the bell is ringing. We just take a quick question and we just get a quick answer from maybe one or at most two of the panelists.
Well, I second David's compliment of the panel for a very informative session. This is actually a very ignorant question. I was just curious why the panel does not include anyone from Singapore, given that the identity of a city is so core, and this is also a very special time for our country because we're changing so much. Who is the guardian of the Singapore soul?
Who is the guardian of the Singapore soul? David, you want to answer that as a former minister? We are. We are. The citizens are. Well, I'm the token Singaporean here, but my job is to moderate, not to speak. I think the movement is much more to a community-led, citizen-led focus and approach. But we know that that's difficult, because once people have lost that sense of ownership, that sense of agency, it's hard to gain that back. So how do you, and we've heard from, I think, all our speakers here, the various ways that they have mobilized community and citizens. Some incredibly successful and really in the thick of it, Some have gone to mobilize government and private sector, and some are in the government or government-linked agencies, working with the various stakeholders. Okay. Oh, and Sun has asked me to mention that this is, in Singapore, we have had a long history of preserving at least some of our heritage, and this is a preserved building, a conserved building, completed in 1928. So it's got nearly 90 years of history with the General Post Office, EDB, and so on, and now it's a heritage hotel. But I think we have run out of time. Please mingle with our distinguished speakers at the tea break if you want to get them to answer specific questions. I think you'll agree with me that it's great to have these visionaries around in the world. Let's give them a round of applause.